Okay. So today we are hosting John Droury. He is a professor of social psychology at the University of Sussex. His main focus is on collective behavior and crowd psychology. More specifically, he studies collective resilience in mass emergencies and disasters, collective action participation as a source of psychological transformation, the practical and political implication of pathologizing versus liberatory discursive construction of crowds, and finally, the relationship between crowd experience and crowd safety in live music events, sports events, and mass gatherings. He is the director of research and knowledge exchange in the School of Psychology at the University of Sussex. He's also a former editor of the British Journal of Social Psychology. Through his work, he has transformed our understanding of crowds and mechanisms through which crowds shape individuals' behavior and vice versa. In addition to numerous publications, he offers professional consultation to various agencies. So thank you, John, for being with us today. It would be great to start off with the question, why the public imagination has a pathological understanding of the crowd, the mass, the collective. Could you please give us some historical context as to why this image of the crowd came about?
Well, there have been negative images of the crowd for centuries. I mean, images which portray the psychology of the crowd as primitive, as simplistic, as gullible, and so on. So they've been around a very long time. You'll see them in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, for example, of the mob attacking one of the somebody with the same name as one of the conspirators. So they go back a very long time. But I suppose they became promoted in society in the late 19th century when science was developing, and the crowd was seen as a threat to the establishment, particularly in France, but across Europe. But it was in France that the crowd was probably seen as most dangerous, because here there had been a series of revolutions in which the crowd was a figure. If you know anything about the Paris Commune, you know that that was consisted of a series of bloody exchanges which ended with the violent deaths of the communards, but the crowd was heavily involved. There was a process of urbanization going on whereby people moved from the villages into the city, and the gentlemen observers, scholars, seeing this, worried that by becoming how they saw it as anonymous in the cities, then there would be less social control of behavior, because they imagine that in the countryside, when people lived in small villages, everybody knew everybody else, and they were able to regulate their behavior, and in the cities that wouldn't be the case. And at the same time, there was industrialization going on, so people were organizing themselves in unions, some of which presented themselves in collective forms and strikes and demonstrations. So for all these reasons, the crowd in the 19th century in France was seen as a threat, and so a science developed to systematize some of those old ideas about crowds and turn them into a new crowd psychology. And there were a number of publications in that time, some of which have endured. And Le Bon's The Crowd, for example, is the most well-known book in crowd psychology, one of the most well-known books in social psychology, in multiple reprints, still in print today. And that sought to popularize some of these ideas, and as well to provide solutions to what was seen as the problem of the crowd. So I would say it's that period and that place that gave rise to the promotion of these negative ideas about the crowd, ideas which had existed in history before that, but hadn't been actively promoted or presented as a science.
Okay, okay. Thank you very much. So I know based on your work that you try to uh, give us a new understanding of the psychology of the crowd, to dispel some of these myths about uh, crowd as a pathological entity. So give us an overview of your model of the psychology of crowd. So how do you see crowd? If this is not the picture that you depicted right now based on Le Bon's work and other people back in the history, if this is not an accurate picture of the crowd, how do you depict us, the crowd, as accurate as possible?
Well, I wouldn't take credit for this. I think the work that kind of changed social psychology towards the modern understanding of the crowd was the work of Stephen Reicher. He was my supervisor, is my collaborator on many works, and this goes back to the 1980s. And he was the first person really in social psychology to develop sort of modern social psychology to develop the alternative to Le Bon, pointing out that, well, if Le Bon was right, what kind of behaviors would one expect in a crowd? And his test case was a rioting crowd, because that's a good test case, because by definition these are violent crowds. I mean, Le Bon's idea implies that crowds tend towards violence, but more than that, he says that when crowds are violent, that violence will be indiscriminate, it will lack a pattern, it will be arbitrary, and therefore there will be no kind of pattern or system to the targets. And so this was tested in Steve Reicher's study of the St. Paul's riot, which took place in the UK in 1980, where he looked at not only the patterns of behavior, looking at any possible limits to the behavior, but the nature of those limits. So what was attacked, who was attacked, what targets were left, which behaviors were regulated by the crowd so that people didn't join in with them. So instead of a process of contagion that Le Bon would suggest, whereby any sentiment or behavior sweeps through the crowd, what Steve Reicher noticed was that some behaviors did spread, such as people throwing stones at the police. Other behaviors didn't spread, such as somebody throwing a stone at a bus. And then looking at the targets, like the question of which behaviors spread, seem to form a pattern. And that pattern mapped on to the definition of identity shared by people in the crowd. So this was a community in Bristol in the UK where there was a history of poor relations with the police, where there was a sense of economic deprivation and economic lack of power. So the targets were the banks, the sources of their lack of power and their economic deprivation, as well as the police, whereas other targets, other possible targets, such as members of the public who were going about their business, doing their shopping, coming home from work, they were completely untouched, as were local houses. So the identity of these participants was as members of this community who defined themselves in terms of this history of poor relations with the police. And even though they had the power to do exactly what they wanted, they used that power in a very selective way. Now, that observation about the selectivity of violent crowds had been made for decades before by other social scientists, but for the first time, we were getting an account of the psychological mechanisms. So I'd say that was that's the basics, the idea of a shared social identity, which replaced the Le Bonian idea that people in crowds lose their identities and regress to a primitive racial unconscious, which is kind of gullible and tends towards violence, because that shared social identity gives people definitions of appropriate conduct, which are social norms. And this is why we find patterns and limits in crowd behavior rather than indiscriminate behavior in even the most violent crowds.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So for conceptual clarity, let me make a distinction between two concepts first. We have this ontological individualism and explanatory individualism. Since we are not metaphysicians, we can put aside the ontological individualism and talk a little bit about explanatory individualism. I think our conceptualization of the individual and the crowd has significant bearing on the way in which we explain people's behavior in the crowd. For example, you can see that people have this understanding that in order to know the crowd's behavior, it's the sum total of the individuals constituting the crowd. Or some would say that in order to understand the crowd, it would be enough to understand the complete psychology of the individuals. What's your theoretical approach, John, here?
Well, I think there are two issues with that kind of individualism. As persuasive as it is from a kind of common sense perspective, it has two fundamental problems. I mean, among the earliest crowd psychology, there was a version of that. So alongside Le Bon's idea that the individual mind is lost and subsumed by a group mind, there was another perspective, an individualistic perspective, which says that what happens in crowds is purely a function of the individuals who assemble. So people aren't transformed in crowds. They simply act out the psychology that they already have as individuals. And the reason that crowds are violent is because they represent the convergence of violent criminal individuals. Well, a major problem with that account was there's never been much evidence that the same kinds of individuals are present at crowd events. I mean, perhaps one of the best tests of this was during the waves of riots in the United States in the 1960s. So there were many urban riots in the United States in that period. And researchers looked for possible differences in attitudes, in psychology, in upbringing between participants and non-participants to try to find whether the participants were what they called riffraffs, unsocialized individuals, and they found no evidence. They were basically the same people, the same kinds of people participated as didn't participate. If there was any difference, it tended to be that the people who did participate were slightly better educated. So it couldn't be reduced to individual differences. So that's the first criticism, that there isn't much evidence for this individualistic perspective. And of course, from a theoretical point of view, it goes against the social identity argument or the social identity model, in which we don't just have one identity, we have multiple identities. We might have personal identities, but we also have social identities. And the social identities that we share consist of norms and values that are not reducible to individuals, but they allow groups of individuals to act as one, because those norms are a property of the group, and that group has a history which is, again, not reducible to those individuals. So that's the first problem with that kind of individualism. The second problem is that it doesn't allow for change. I mean, as much as we find the Le Bonian approach problematic, there's one feature of it which is quite interesting, which is that it is a transformation theory. It says that people change in crowds. And although most crowds are not associated with change, they're not associated with social change, there are some crowd events that involve such profound psychological changes and sometimes are bound up with social changes that they are really important to look at and to understand, because they provide insights into the human condition. So when I started looking at crowds empirically, this is what I was looking at. So this is moving on from that original social identity model, which is a model of the determination of behavior, the way that social identity determines behavior. So if you see yourself in a group, then you behave in line with the norms of that group. But if you look at some of these crowds where change is involved, that's clearly not enough. What about the crowd that turns up at a protest event with peaceful intentions? They go on a peaceful march and it ends in crowd violence, right? So what about these examples? Does that suggest Le Bon is correct? Well, no, because there's a better explanation in terms of social identity principles. And this forces us to make another observation about crowds, another key observation, that crowd events typically consist of more than one group, right? So you've got a group of people who are the crowd, but very often, particularly when it's protest crowds, social movements, there's another group there, the police. So you've got two groups and you've got a relationship between two groups. I mean, one of the features of those early crowd theories from the 19th century onwards that tried to portray the crowd as irrational was that in their accounts, they completely excluded the role of the authorities, the police, the army. They took the crowd out of its context. And then when the crowd was violent, it appeared there was no reason because there was no other group present. So in a series of studies, we've looked at this process of change and the psychological underpinnings and psychological consequences. So the starting point is, once again, a crowd has a shared social identity. It enacts that. It acts in a way that is consistent with its norms, which is its definition of appropriate conduct. But where there is another group present, where the police are present, and where the police see the crowd's action, the crowd's behavior as illegitimate, where they don't agree with the crowd on the appropriateness of the crowd's conduct, that is the first condition for the dynamics of change that we're talking about here. Now, to give you an example, so a crowd might traditionally have a sit-down protest. I mean, it's quite interesting we're talking about this because at the very time we're talking, there are sit-down protests across campuses in the USA. And if you look at the footage, people are doing things which look like, to me, like traditional protest actions. They're having a sit-down, they're occupying space, and for them, I can imagine this is a traditional protest. This is a peaceful protest. This is a legitimate protest, okay? Whereas the other group, the group managing that event or the group responding to that event, the police, are defining this as illegal, as threatening, as disorderly. So there is an asymmetry of representations of the behavior of that crowd. That's not enough for conflict. For conflict and psychological change to occur, there has to be a second condition. And that condition is that the other group, the police, has the power to turn that understanding, their understanding, into reality. They have the numbers of officers, they have the weaponry, they have the horses, they have the organization to physically move the crowd, to arrest people in the crowd, to assault people in the crowd, to assert themselves and to assert their understanding. Now, where protesters see their own action as legitimate and within the law and so on, they will then see that action by the police as illegitimate. Therefore, that starts to legitimize the appropriateness of self-defense and sometimes of retribution and sometimes of punishment. In many of the events we looked at, people not only sought to defend themselves, but sought to punish the other group and go on the offensive. And that's where you start to get the escalation. However, that too is not enough, right? Because you've got these two dimensions, the kind of normative dimension of legitimacy. You've also got the power dimension. But what starts to happen in at least some of these events is that the power starts to shift. Now, this is particularly the case where you've got a very large crowd, which is also quite mixed. Because when you've got a very large crowd, which is also quite mixed in its intentions, you sometimes got more radical elements who would support a more radical response from the beginning, and you've got more kind of pacifist, peaceful protesters as well. Or you've got different groups who just see themselves as a very mixed group. But that police action very often has the effect of changing those boundaries, of creating a common experience or common fate for all those different groups who now see themselves as a single group. And there's a basic social identity function that comes in then, because when people share social identity with others, they expect support from them for in-group normative action, for action which is in line with the group identity and its values and its norms. Now, we've just said that the new norms and values are around self-defense, punishment, retaliation, but now they've got the backup, they've got the power to enact that, right? So in those events that escalated, that we studied, that's what you saw. People fought back and were able to fight back, and they drove the police back because they had the power to do so. So there you've got a process of psychological change whereby a peaceful crowd becomes violent, but still within the contours and the boundaries of social identity, but it's a new identity. I mean, my own PhD research was about the lasting effects of experiences like that, because even though we're talking about a crowd event, for some people, that experience was so new to be positioned in relation to the authorities in that way, to be part of this movement of people capable of challenging the authorities was a revelation, right? And it transformed them as individuals because part of their identity as individuals was formed by their group membership. So it's still an identity process. It's not a loss of identity. It's a new identity that arises within the event. And it's not, again, it's not reducible to the personal identity of the individuals that came along, although that is relevant, because if you saw yourself as a law-abiding citizen, a law-abiding individual, the contrast for you between that self-understanding and the way you are treated as a group member by the police is so powerful that it changes your self-understanding.
Yeah. So that's a very rich understanding of the crowd psychology, I think, because you take into account, you added at least one more element, which is the other party, the other group, and the interaction between the two, and how the social identities can change through these interactions in, let's say, a collective action. Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
very rich understanding, I think. Uh, I kind of heard the sound of the oppositional identity that I think it's one of the concepts that I came across in one of your papers. Can you elaborate a little bit on oppositional identity? Because it kind of resonates with what you just described here, that we see ourselves against a group of people. Then it could be the case that our differences within the crowd now, because we are opposing the other side, we are as one more than before. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I think there are different dimensions. I mean, when I researched this, I categorized it into 4 dimensions. There's a sense of like, who am I? Who are we? You know, what is the content of that identity? Am I, when I come to this event and I looked at non-violent environmental direct activists, when I come to this event, do I see myself as a respectable citizen simply enacting my rights, and I protest on that basis? But that can change. I mean, when we say oppositional, we mean somebody who now is critical of the police, who no longer sees the government as neutral, who is more aligned with other protesters around the country, around the world, who categorizes self with them instead, who will never. I heard some very striking personal accounts of the way these kinds of changes impacted on people's everyday lives. If I get burgled, I will not go to the police in the future. This kind of thing. So that's kind of identity content, and it's kind of overlapping too with identity boundaries, because when you see yourself as a respectable middle-class citizen, you are probably seeing other local residents who are not protesters as part of your group, and you're distinguishing yourself from protesters. So that there are the group boundaries, and the police are probably neutral, or maybe they're part of the community. But then after these kinds of experiences, the boundaries have changed, because the in-group is now these protesters. You might not have met them personally, but they're on the same side of your cause. And those other respectable middle-class local residents, the ones who didn't get involved in the protest, right now they are excluded from the in-group. So you've got the boundaries going on there. But the other dimensions are power again, of course, because when you've got more people the more people you've got in your group, the more empowered you could become. We heard some striking and powerful stories of people becoming more confident after some of these experiences, when they felt that they were part of a group, a campaign that was able to enact its identity over and against the power of the other side. And then the other dimension is legitimacy again, which, what counts as normative. So one of the changes that came about was the legitimacy and appropriateness of direct action to expose the authorities, because once people believed the authorities had acted unfairly against them, they moved from simply protesting against the road building, which was the original substantive issue, to the issue of the right to protest itself. Okay, and you very often see that. So you get this kind of meta protest. And so they moved on to that, and some of the subsequent direct actions were about exposing the authorities and showing them up, not just about the environment, because the boundaries have changed. So that when we say oppositional, that these are my examples, and these are the dimensions of change.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think most media, for various reasons, have been focusing on only the crowd and the crowd behavior, and they disregard most of the time this interaction that they see, that they say, oh, that the crowd was violent, or the crowd was this, the crowd was that, without taking into account all the dynamics that you just talked about. I think that's a very important point. Let me shift gear toward another focus of your research, which is collective resilience, and then we can close the interview. So you work on collective resilience, and these days we have wars, we have natural disasters, and so on and so forth. And the topic of resilience is kind of sexy. Everybody talks about resilience. And correct me if I'm wrong, but at least when I survey most of the talks when it comes to resilience, it seems to me that most of them are geared toward this individualistic approach of resilience, that you should do this, you should do that, we need to do, which is good and necessary, but I think it's not enough. What do you mean by collective resilience, and what a space we still have for collective resilience, what it adds, what type of knowledge it adds?
Yeah, I mean, it's become a buzzword, and it became a popular word institutionally after 9/11. After 9/11, the attack on the World Trade Center, then governments around the world sought to introduce policies and strategies of resilience, and that's when you started seeing a lot more of it. And then the term exists in psychology, and as you point out, it is usually understood as an individual disposition. So I'm not talking about that. I mean, I tell you how I came to be interested in this. We wanted to move on from studying crowds involved in protest and conflict and campaigns and social movements to crowds involved in mass emergencies, because here too there was a history of pathologizing, of characterizing the crowd as particularly prone to irrationality, to mental weakness, etc. And of course, that is through the term mass panic, the idea that when there's an emergency, social bonds break down, people become competitive in an uncontrolled way, their judgment goes, they lose control, that kind of thing. Originally, we wanted to compare events where maybe that happened with events where it didn't happen, where people behaved in a more coordinated way. It ended up, we couldn't find many examples of mass panic. And my position now is that mass panic is such an unhelpful concept that I would never, ever use it to characterize any crowd event in an emergency, although there are some evacuations in which there's a bit more pushing and a bit more competition. But, you know, the whole concept of panic and the notion of judging when a behavior is inappropriate is so difficult, right? Now, when do you say a behavior is an overreaction? It's a value, it's a judgment that you don't need to make. It's not very scientific. It's more of a kind of, a personal judgment. So then the question became, and I wasn't the first to address this, why do people coordinate in emergencies when they're trying to escape, when you might say that the most logical thing to do is to just look after your own personal safety? Why would you take time? Why would you risk your own safety to help others and to cooperate with others? But it does happen. And so we need an explanation of that. So coming back to a direct answer to your question, when I say collective resilience, I'm particularly interested in that, in a process by which groupness emerges in situations like that, emergencies, disasters, where people don't necessarily have bonds or don't have the same bonds, and then people are able to draw upon the resources that a shared identity gives them in terms of expected support, in terms of the ability to coordinate, to have a shared understanding with others, and to give support as well, that enables them to deal with that emergency in a more adaptive and effective way. So that's the phenomenon that I'm interested in, and that's what I've been focused on with the research.
And this shared understanding, John, it emerges during the event. It's not something that existed before, right?
Yeah, so the idea is that, I'll give you a good example, right? Because this was one of the first studies that we did of this, and it was of a terrorist attack on an underground train or underground trains during rush hour. Now, the point about that is the people going to work during rush hour, they're not people who are already in a group. They are commuters. They have no connection. If you look at the way other disciplines talk about adaptive response in emergencies, they talk about a thing called social capital. So social capital is a way of talking about pre-existing connections between people in a community or a society that in an adverse situation they draw upon to help them cope. But you can't talk about social capital in a bunch of commuters on a tube train during rush hour. They haven't got any connection with each other. But when you looked at the behavior of those people, they behaved in a very kind of groupy kind of way. And the spontaneous reports of cooperative behavior were very common. So in answer to your question, well, no, there was no pre-existing idea or pre-existing connection between people. We interviewed survivors. They said, no, I was just, I didn't think about the people I was with. I was just trying to get a seat. You don't, you look at anybody on a tube train, a train, in rush hour, they're just minding their own business. But afterwards, they described, using a very rich vocabulary, a sense of connection. When I say afterwards, I mean immediately after the bomb had gone off, while they were still trapped underground and coping, trying to escape, trying to give each other support before the emergency services arrived. They described a relationship with others which now was enriched, was groupy, was connected, was warm. And this was associated with these numerous reports of social support, whether it's sharing a bottle of water, lifting somebody up, tying a bandage, all sorts of things. And so it fits with a social identity account in which a new identity emerges from a sense of common fate. Because although we think of social identities, in terms of normative fit, i.e., you've got a pre-existing historical definition of the identity, and does it match? But some identities are created in the moment, and John Turner talked about this. John Turner, who is the father of social identity theory, self-categorization theory, talked about this in 1981 as common fate being it's not common fate that leads to cooperation. Common fate leads to shared social identity, and shared social identity is the basis of cooperation. Because once you're in the same group, you see others in the same group, you care about them more. The boundaries of concern have extended to other people, even if they're complete strangers. So yeah, that's what we're talking about.
That's right. That's right. Thank you very much. And the last question, in Iran, we are seeing this mass mobilization, revolution, social movements, or people use different terminology to describe it. And the issue, to my understanding, is that whenever something happens in the society, people start talking about resilience from an individualistic point of view. What would be the best way or ways to strengthen the collective resilience in order to have some kind of, I don't know, energy, support, that when we face these new atrocities committed by the government, we can rely on this collective resilience that we have built before. Give us some advice based on your research that if we want to build up this collective resiliency, what should we do?
Well, as I said, for me, collective resilience is a process, not a thing. But if you're asking me, how can you get the benefits of group psychology in a social movement, which is the broader question, really, it's a great question because we have kind of looked at that in relation to disasters like floods, because you get these fantastic spontaneous groups like I've described with the bombing that arise, that help people. And after a disaster like a flood, they fade away. Okay, they fade away when people still need them, because as you would know, after a flood, people are still suffering from the damage of their homes, the need to rebuild for months and months afterwards, and they still need help. How can you keep that groupness alive? This is the question, right? Because groups are good. How can you keep groups alive? Well, some of the things would be, well, what about a place to meet? What about a technology for connection? What about a regular meeting? What about a name for the group? So all those things would be basic recommendations. I mean, what helps people form a group and keep a group? Simply having a place where they can regularly connect would help them do that. Regular meetings would help them do that. So these are not surprising suggestions. And one thing I hesitate to do really is to presume to advise activists, because activists know what works, right? Activists know what works. All I can do as a social psychologist is say, well, you're right. I've looked at this in another context, and the thing that you're doing, the meeting, the march, these work, right? These create a sense of groupness, and groupness is a good thing. It makes people feel part of something, empowers them, and so on. So just those basic infrastructures for groupness is what I would recommend.
Cool. I said it was my last question, but as the real last question, where crowd psychology is going? What type of research you think crowd psychology still has to do? What get you excited about crowd psychology as a future research?
Well, from the examples we've been talking about, they are dramatic events which are sometimes associated with distress and tragedy and so on. But of course, most crowds are not like that. Most crowds do not involve distress, do not involve tragedy. You think of music events, think of sports events. I know sometimes music events and sports events, and particularly we're talking about Iran, football events associated with resistance. I know there's that history too, but most events, people are just having a great time, right? But then, there's risk there with some of these events, but they're great experiences. So I think there's huge amounts of scope. I mean, this is something I'm currently working on: the psychology of positive experience and crowd safety at events, because the crowd safety industry at live events is thirsty for crowd psychology to maximize positive experience and safety for the people that come to their events. So that's, I think, the future.
Okay, okay, thank you very much. And yes, we are crazy, just like English people when it comes to football, not soccer as they call it here.
Yeah, right.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate you taking the time and share your knowledge and experience with us. I hope this would not be the last time we talk about social
Sure,
psychology and
yeah.
psychology. Again, thank you very much.
Thanks,
If you
Nima.
allow me, let me stop the